So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Jakub Nowakowski, and I'm the director of the Galicia Jewish Museum in Kraków, Poland. And it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome all of you at this panel, a final discussion to the set of talks devoted to the contemporary Polish-Jewish relations. These discussions that started in August are accompanying our new mobile application called Photographs from Jewish Poland that was created thanks to the generous support of the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a part of the program called Public Diplomacy 2020, a New Dimension. The application was also created in collaboration with our US partner, Magnus Collection of Jewish Art. In a second, I will introduce a moderator of this panel, and she will be the one that will introduce our panelists. But before that, let me just make a few housekeeping comments. The discussion will last around 60 minutes, and depending on the availability of our guests, we may be able to take a few questions at the very end. So please do write them in the chat. The discussion will be recorded and will be available on the Galicia Jewish Museum YouTube channel and the Facebook page where it's broadcasted right now. And last but not least, among the participants, we can see many friends. Let me just say on behalf of all of us here in Kraków, we missed you very much this year in Poland. And so with no further delay, let me introduce moderator of this discussion, Dr. Edyta Gawron. Edyta Gawron is an assistant professor at the Institute of Jewish Studies here at the Jagiellonian University in Kraków. She is a specialist in the 20th century history of Polish Jews and the Holocaust. Dr. Gawron cooperates with various academic institutions and museums in Poland and abroad. She has curated or co-curated several exhibitions at museums promoting Jewish history in Poland and serves as the president of the board of the Galicia Jewish Museum and also as the member of the board of the Jewish Community Center here in Kraków. So with no further delay, Edyta, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Kuba, for the introduction. Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you for the discussion on such interesting topic, but also with such distinguished colleagues and friends. Before introducing the speakers, let me welcome everyone in the audience, everyone who have joined us today or tonight, depending where you're joining, and especially our special guests who join us, including Ted Taube, Honorary Consul of Poland in San Francisco and the founder of Taube Philanthropies, Sean Taube, one of the directors of the Taube Family Foundation, our distinguished professors and dear friends, Professor Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblet and Professor Antoni Poloński. And also let me greet the representatives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Culture and National Heritage. Both of these ministries have been supporting programs and projects related to the Polish-Jewish relations, whether it's a presentation of the exhibition of photos taken by Chuck Fishman, documenting revival of Jewish life in Poland, that in 2019 was presented in the States, in close cooperation with the Polish Embassy in Washington, D.C., or presentation of Galicia Jewish Museum's core exhibition, Traces of Memory, in South Africa and Japan, where the exhibition is actually right now. Finally, I would like to welcome all the supporters and friends, many of whom are involved in the process, which we are going to discuss soon. We are going to talk about the rebirth of life and culture that began in Poland over 30 years ago. And it was possible thanks to the involvement of many people and institutions within Poland and abroad. The Galicia Jewish Museum is happy to host this panel discussion with the representatives of some of the most important American and European foundations, which worked and helped to shape the landscape of contemporary Jewish Poland after 1989. Beside the foundations that are represented today or tonight, there are some others. We are not able to mention and host all, and there are certainly institutions such as JDC or a Jewish Humanitarian Fund that should be also at least mentioned. And there are many others that I hope we will have a chance to discuss during maybe some other panel discussions, because it's certainly worth and it's interesting. Without any further delay, let me introduce our special guest tonight. And I'll present in the alphabetical order. Representing Rothschild Foundation Hanadiv Europe, Sally Berkovic, who is the CEO of Rothschild Foundation Hanadiv Europe, which aims to ensure that Jewish culture and heritage are valued and looked after for the future generations. Sally Berkovic grew up in Melbourne, Australia, where her parents were amongst thousands of Holocaust survivors that built a new life there after the Holocaust. She trained and worked as a social worker for over 10 years and lived in Israel, in the States, working as a journalist before settling in London, where she is now. Welcome, Sally, and thank you for joining. Mr. Jeffrey Farber, representing Koret Foundation. Mr. Farber joined the Koret Foundation as the Chief Executive Officer in 2005. In this capacity, he oversees all foundation business, leading the staff and board in executing grant-making strategies and managing the foundation's assets. His over 30 years of business experience ranges from executive positions at Bank of America to vice chairman and chief operating officer at Schorstein, to partner of a boutique financial services firm. Mr. Farber's community and philanthropic leadership activities span numerous roles in both the general and the Jewish communities. He is past chair of IPAC of Northern California and a former board member of the Jewish Community Federation of San Francisco, Peninsula, Marin, and Sonoma counties. Jeff, nice to see you today. Welcome to the panel. And the next speaker is Shana Penn, representing Taube Foundation. Shana Penn is the executive director of Taube Philanthropies in San Francisco and a scholar in residence at the Graduate Theological Union Center for Jewish Studies in Berkeley. Her book, Solidarity's Secret, The Women Who Defeated Communism in Poland, published in 2005, was awarded Best Book in Slavic and Eastern European Women's Studies by the European Association in Women in Slavic Studies. It was published also in Polish as Sekret Solidarności in 2014. A year later, Shana Penn was awarded the Commander's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland for both her gender research and the advocacy of Polish-Jewish relations. And Shana is currently writing about the reconstruction of European Jewish collective identities in the years that we are going to discuss, 1989 to 2015. So it overlaps with the period we will be talking about. Shana, we are so happy to have you on the panel today. And last but not least, Rabbi Joshua Spinner, representing Ronald S.Lauder Foundation. joining us from Berlin. Joshua Spinner is the Executive Vice President and CEO of the Ronald S.Lauder Foundation. Born in the United States, Josh has also lived in Canada, Israel, Belarus, and Germany. Active in the fields of collaborative philanthropy, strategic planning for Jewish communities and schools, and security for Jewish educational institutions. Mr. Spinner serves in executive and governance capacities for initiatives and institutions, including Educating for Impact, the Pillar Foundation, the Westberry Group, and the Rabbiner Seminar in Berlin. And as I mentioned, he is joining us from Berlin, where he lives with his wife and daughters. Josh, welcome to our panel. And now, as you know, all the panelists, we can start the discussion. I'm so happy that we are having this debate today. So far, the debates we hosted, the discussion we hosted, were focusing on Jewish culture, political and social changes in Poland. And today we would like to learn about the involvement and organizations, individuals and organizations that supported and stimulated all those changes. So without the institutions that you represent, most of these changes wouldn't have been possible, and probably the conditions we have right now would not be reached, and all the Jewish communities, Jewish education institutions, Jewish museums, and Jewish studies centers would not have been where they are today. So we'll have a series of questions, and I would like to start with the basic one, at least the basic as it looks to me is, I would like to ask each of you to present, to answer the question and to present your institutions, basically following the question, why did your foundation, the foundation you represent, become involved in Poland? And how would you describe the starting point for the activities in Poland for your involvement? And I would like to follow the suggestion that Shana Penn made to follow the chronology. So the first foundation that was involved in Poland was S.Lauder Foundation.
Okay, thank you.
Josh, could you start?
Yeah, with pleasure. So it was some time ago. It was 1987, and the Ronald Lauder Foundation had been established by Ambassador Lauder in Vienna. And the first places that Mr. Lauder looked to engage with Jewish communities in this very exciting and tense and rapidly changing world that he saw from his perch at the ambassador's residence in Vienna were Hungary and Poland. And so in 1988, the Ronald S. Lauder Foundation began funding in Poland with funding for some very basic grassroots activities. In 1989, some steps were taken towards formalizing educational activities for children with the formation of a children's group that became a kindergarten. And in September 1st, 1994, the Lauder Morasha School was opened. And so the story began very early. For Mr. Lauder, this was about the world of extraordinary opportunity and change, this miraculous world that was coming about in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And it was about ensuring that people who had the opportunity for the first time in decades to publicly say, I'm Jewish and I want to do something about that, would have the means, the resources, the connections, the networks to make that possible. So Poland was a very, very early part of that story for Ronald Lauder. and for the foundation.
And why the decision was made to start with the schools?
That's an easy one if you work for Ronald Lauder. Mr. Lauder believes passionately in formal Jewish education as the single most compelling guarantor of Jewish continuity. If you want to have an active Jewish community with active Jewish members, Jewish education is critical, and formal Jewish education is at the heart of that. And so while the foundation has engaged in many places, including in Poland, in a wide range of educational activities, including informal education, youth centers, camps, certainly the heart of what we do everywhere is about Jewish day schools. And so that was a very, very clear statement from the beginning. And Poland was one of the first places where we made it.
And certainly Poland needed education because the Jewish schools were closed either in the 50s or the last in the 60s. So for a long time, there was no Jewish school present in Poland and no Jewish education provided. And what was the starting point for the Taube Foundation in Poland, Shana?
Okay, and I just want to, I'm not sure if Rothschild or Taube is next, but we're probably around the same time. Well, there's several interconnected parts to our starting point in the early 2000s. One is Tad Taube's personal history. When he was 8 years old in 1939, he and his parents left Poland on the eve of the war's outbreak. Most of his family members who remained perished in the Holocaust. And that's not my phone, but someone may hear my dog at some point. So Tad and his parents and their emigre circles in New York and Los Angeles did not turn against Poland as so many who experienced the Holocaust there understandably did. Later, as a businessman, Tad visited Poland several times in the communist 1970s and 80s. And then as the political transition began in the late 80s, Tad helped finance the return of key Polish state archives from the Hoover Institution at Stanford, where they had been safeguarded since the Nazi occupation of Poland through the prescient efforts of Poland's government in exile in London. And on this landmark occasion in '89, for which Tad was honored by the Polish government, he witnessed the promising political transformation underway and continued to observe the democratization process. And as for myself, I had been working as a researcher and activist in Poland and other parts of the post-communist region, and helping to support the building of nonprofit sectors in a number of countries. And it was a very exciting time. Also, in the late 90s, academics at Stanford University's Taube Center for Jewish Studies reported to Tad and myself the noteworthy Jewish studies forums that they had attended at Polish universities and cultural centers. And they encouraged his foundation's involvement in Poland, given the foundation's interests in archives, libraries, academia, and cultural interests. So at this time, Tad invited me to work with him to develop a philanthropic program. We believed it was important to cooperate with donors and organizations that were already active in Poland. And initially, we met with Ronald Lauder, Ambassador Lauder, the JDC, the AJC, the Polish government ministries, and we were very aware and impressed with the Lauder Foundation's creation of a communal infrastructure centered on traditional religious education. Their work carried out over the 90s was in a period that I think of as a heady, exciting, heroic phase of infusing lifeblood into new nonprofit and community startups. And by 2000, Polish Jews who were interested not in Orthodox Judaism exclusively or at all, but rather in reform and conservative religious practice or in Jewish culture and not religion, sought viable space in the communal landscape for their own legitimate interests. Fortunately, there was a landscape that already existed. No Jewish community is of one voice, and certainly that was never the case in Poland, not even within one family. And it seemed time to support the multiplicity of Jewish interests, as well as to help people who are only now realizing their Jewish roots make meaning of their Jewishness through a variety of pursuits. At the time, it seemed we could also bridge what had become a gap between Jewish organizations headed by Jews and those that were headed by people who are not Jewish. It seemed there had been tensions that could be overcome that had been rendered by competition for resources and worthiness. So whether led by Poles who are Jewish or not Jewish, these organizations contributed to both Jewish communal life and Polish civic life in very important ways. A democratic culture, we believed, must encourage good neighbors and conscientious citizens among different social groups. I'll always remember in our first meeting with Ronald S.Lauder, he advised us not to operate alone or no one will want to join us along the way. He said, work collaboratively. Well, if you are familiar with Taube and our foundation, you know that collaborative philanthropy is a building block for all we do. Especially in Poland, it was important to invite material and intellectual endorsement from American and European Jewish leaders in their fields, which we did, including along with Ronald S.Lauder, the Koret Foundation, Sigmund Rolat, and the Rothschild Foundation, who at the time was under the directorship of Tony Lerman. We were greatly aided by, guided by, and inspired by all of the foundations and donors that we worked with. Our priorities were to provide organizations with core general operational support, with capacity building skills, partnerships within and outside Poland, technical assistance, all towards supporting their sustainability over time. In keeping with our Jewish priorities for the San Francisco Bay Area and Israel, in Poland, Taube Philanthropies supports primarily Jewish academic, cultural, and communal institutions, such as archives, libraries, museums, JCCs, and festivals. Starting with the Jewish Historical Institute, Jewish Studies at the Center for Jewish Culture, and later at universities and the Jewish Culture Festival. Those were our initial grants in 2003. Through our relationship with Ronald S.Lauder, we also began supporting the Chief Rabbi of Poland, the Genealogy Center at the Jewish Historical Institute, and the Lauder Marasha Day School. In addition, a new generation was coming of age, some of whom were from the first generation of graduates from the Lauder Marasha School. And we learned from them. They asked for our strategic and financial support in addressing their specific needs as a younger generation who had a Jewish identity and needed to build up their community and to be able to find cause and inspiration for staying in Poland. And they asked for our strategic and financial support. This includes Cholent and Push. And from here, we move beyond our starting point to the starting points of newly forming organizations around 2005, which include the Polin Museum, the Galicia Jewish Museum, and the JCCs. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Shana. As we couldn't decide on chronology between the Taube Foundation and the Rothschild Foundation, Hanadiv Europe, now I'll ask Sally to continue. What was the starting point? Why did you decide to be involved in Poland?
Sure, thank you. I think that our starting point could be framed perhaps as a sentence from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who many of you will know unfortunately recently passed away. And he said, the single most important challenge facing the Jewish people in Israel and the diaspora is to recover the Jewish story. And I think that all of us, in all very different ways, are helping to uncover, discover, and then recover this Jewish story. Now, the Rothschild family, who you all know their roots are in Germany, have a long history of philanthropy. A band of 5 brothers left Frankfurt for different parts of the world, the 5 arrows of the famous family crest, to London, Paris, Vienna, Frankfurt, and Naples. And in London, they established the Rothschild Bank and gave to a wide range of charitable causes. These included the arts, culture, and building projects, as well as actually helping poor Jewish communities who came to London from Eastern Europe. And at the same time, this branch of the family also became big supporters of initiatives in Israel. Many of you will be familiar with the establishment of various yeshuvim, the wineries, and important buildings such as the Knesset, the Supreme Court, and now the National Library of Israel. However, their interest in contemporary European Jewish affairs is relatively recent. And we're just talking about the chronology now. In the late 1990s, and Lord Rothschild often cites Mr. Lauder, he took an interest in and saw what was happening in Europe more broadly, and obviously including the fall of communism. He took an interest in both the emerging Jewish communities, but also the Jewish heritage that had been neglected. The buildings, the cemeteries, the artwork, the archives, and he set about thinking how to help. I was not there at the time. As Shana mentioned, one of my predecessors, Tony Lerman, was there at the beginning. And from what I've pieced together, there was a certain amount of experimentation, trying to assess where our help could be most impactful. Now, when you're sitting in London, and from what I know, it takes a long time, if ever, to really understand what's going on in the actual place. It takes a lot of, you've got to meet people, talk to people, a range of different people. So I know that Tony did a lot of that initially, and I try and continue to do that as well in my role, because you have to work out, how do you know the issues? How do you learn about them? Where is the community that you think you're helping? Who are these people? So you asked about the starting point of our grant making. So I actually pulled up from our database, and the first grant was in 2002. So I think, Shana, we're just in parallel there. And it was to support the Midrash publication, and which I understand went for a long time, but I believe recently ended. And that was support, giving voice to Jewish culture in that way, and also grants to the Krakow Jewish Festival and for supporting scholars in Jewish studies at various universities. I'll talk a little bit later about our grants, but in essence, there was a commitment to scholarship as the field of academic Jewish studies was starting to open up, and to culture in its broadest forms. And those areas really complement the Rothschild family's general interest in arts, the humanities, and culture. So Lord Rothschild and the trustees really trying to marry up what their general interests are with how to reflect that in their Jewish interests. That gives you a bit of a flavor.
Thank you, Sally, for this just introduction into the foundation's work in Poland, and we look forward to more on that later. And with the first question to be addressed, we move to Jeff Farber.
Thank you. I joined Koret, as Edyta said, in 2005. And 2 months later, originally through Taube as board president, the foundation got involved, and his interest in rebuilding Jewish life in Poland. Koret's interest in Poland was and is part of the foundation's initiative on Jewish peoplehood, which seeks to increase Jewish identification and involvement. And one way we encourage this is through building connections of Jewish history and heritage and the global Jewish community. 80% of American Jews today can trace their heritage to the historic Galicia region. And we know that 60% of American Jews feel connected to being Jewish because of history and ancestry. Supporting Poland's Jewish life was and is important to help Jews and non-Jewish allies tell the story of Polish Jewish history and provide a place for Polish Jews to be part of the Jewish community. And supporting institutions that Poles and North American Jews can reconnect with their heritage and their history. It's far too easy only to think of Jewish life in Poland from the war through communism today. But for 1,000 years before that, Jewish life in Poland thrived. It was a center, as we all know, of religion, literature, art, culture, music, food, politics. And Koret's investment, starting in 2005, was and is about recognizing this history and celebrating the rebuilding of a Jewish community and creating connections for North American Jews and other Jews around the world with their heritage.
Thank you, Jeff, for this just introduction to the activities of Koret Foundation. We hope to hear more. In the meantime, we started to get the first questions in our chat, and I will allow myself to mention one of them that will also lead to the first question in the second round that I will ask to Shana. Professor Gershon Hundert asked the question, what do these foundations see as the biggest obstacles to their work going forward? And I think this is the question I wanted to ask Shana in the context of the history. So looking backward, what were the challenges and obstacles particular to working in Poland with the attention to the dynamic political situation? How has it affected the foundation's activity in Poland?
Okay, I get the provocative question. And I just wanted to say that I think Gerson's question is also about the future and how we perceive the future. And I hope that all four of us can talk about that toward the end.
We will get back to it.
Okay, but I'd like to describe two challenges. And since we began our Jewish Heritage Initiative in Poland almost 20 years ago, one main challenge has been to address the negative stereotypes about Poland as being eternally anti-Semitic and unwelcoming to Jews, and why would we bother to invest our resources there? So Taube Philanthropies has, here's the dog, one second. All right. Taube Philanthropies has long devoted advocacy and public education efforts to countering deep-seated anti-Polish bias among diaspora and Israeli Jews with historical accuracy and opportunities for reconciliation, with direct encounters with Poland through, for example, the Warsaw Taube Center's educational heritage tours in Poland, through traveling exhibits and visiting lecturers from Poland to the US, especially the Bay Area where we work, such as the Galicia Jewish Museum and Polin Museum, Jewish Historical Institute, Genealogy Center, and others. A Midrash magazine, and Konstanty Gebert was a very important advisor to us in the 1990s and early 2000s. And through understanding that for us, it was important that where democracy thrives, Jewish life can also thrive. And that was noted to us by the Chancellor Emeritus of the Jewish Theological Seminary, Dr. Arnie Eisen, after a Jewish leaders visit to Poland with us in 2005. And I'm sure that Ambassador Lauder and the Lauder Foundation and Rothschild Foundation and Koret Foundation all share this experience with us. And a second main challenge is what to do when democracy is not thriving, and when a government fails to speak out against anti-Semitism and instead can fan its fires. What do we do? So one example is the international crisis instigated by the Holocaust, the so-called Holocaust law, the EPN law from 2018. And sometimes this occurred then, we as a philanthropy become a public voice of constructive critique and advocacy, which can to a certain extent challenge or compete with our ability to conduct our main affairs as a philanthropy, but we find it well worth doing. we realized we need to act. And also Taube is an honorary consul for the Republic of Poland in San Francisco, and I am the vice consul. And we take those roles very seriously. We appreciate that not only civic and Jewish community leaders in Poland ask for our assistance, but additionally, American Jewish leaders in media ask for our analysis, come to us for advice on what they might also do, and under how to understand different issues. And equally important, certain government officials within the foreign ministry also seek out our advice on a regular basis with regards to challenges such as anti-Semitism. I think maybe one of the most important things to point out is that whereas in the early 90s, when the Polish Jewish communities were newly forming and not strong enough to speak in their own names solely, there were advocacy groups like the AJC who worked with them or represented them. The chief, Michael Shudrick, in his role first at the S.Lauder Foundation, and then as the rabbi of Łódź and Warsaw, and then the chief rabbi of Poland, has always played this multifaceted, taken on willingly, this multifaceted role, and he does it very well, as grassroots diplomat, as advocate, as well as spiritual guide and humanitarian. And we have learned so much from him. But since 2005, the Jewish community, the Jewish communities and Jews in Poland, who are not necessarily affiliated with communities, but are affiliated with their identities and with different organizations and programs, have found their own voices. And while they look to partner with us to make certain interests known and to strategize together or to advocate together, Jewish community leaders can represent themselves and do so extremely well. I mean, one sees that even going back, why I point to 2005, it was because the year that homophobic campaigns had begun to arise in Poland, and there were protests against gay pride marches in many cities, and the Jewish community came out for the LGBTQ community at that time, and I think it really empowered Jews to understand that that they, as Jews, must speak out against all violations of human rights.
Thank you, Shana, for this very insightful comment on political challenges and social challenges also in Poland. It's been really interesting and interesting, let's put it this way, the diplomatic way, time for Jewish community. But I'm glad you mentioned the community leaders who became conscious of what was going on, not only in the Jewish community, but all around in Poland. And they were confident enough, self-confident enough to speak up and take the stand in situations like this. Talking about the community, I would like to move to Josh and S.Lauder Foundation. And how do you see the Jewish community in Poland changing over this time? And how your activity, I mean, individual activity, but also foundation's activity adjusted the forms of support to the community in Poland?
So I think one of the fascinating things about this conversation is that the perspective that we four Jews who are not resident in Poland and who are by profession, by choice, by passion, participants of a kind in this story, but also to some extent outsiders are, is that we have a certain role in which we're able to provide a perspective, and that's an important piece of the conversation tonight. But in responding to your question, I would say that another piece of this is the complexity of our role as interventionists. We are interventionists. We come with a set of values and ideas and agendas and mandates, and we arrive. And like everywhere, and this is not a Poland issue and it's not a Jewish life specific issue, but in the field of philanthropy, there's a very, very delicate and difficult balance between arriving somewhere and simply supporting local people in doing that which they aspire to do, and in writing their own narratives on the one hand, and on the other hand, arriving and presenting, promoting, recruiting for a projected narrative. And I think that, you know, as Jeff said, this is a very long story. This is a story of millennia. This particular chapter, right, which is a small chapter in this long story, is already becoming a chapter of respectable chronological length, right? We're talking about 3 decades, more than 3 decades since opportunity began, since political change made possible the open expression of Judaism and organization in many different ways around being Jewish and living as a Jew and articulating oneself in whatever way one chose as a Jew. And so there's been time to develop narratives. Sometimes there's a concern, at least, and this is in our field, in the field of Jewish education, that our projection of narratives is a little too strong. And so one of the things that I would say has changed or should change is the need for local communities to have a little bit less of us, a little bit less of us. So while our role has been important, too much of our role and too much of a certain kind of role is ultimately not healthy. And so one hopes that over time, over more than 3 decades, as people who themselves had the opportunity to explore their Judaism in an open society, and again, in a very, very raw and novel and fledgling set of opportunities, but nonetheless in an open society, as they themselves become parents of children, it becomes important to adjust oneself down, to step back, to allow for local narratives, for authentically driven narratives of the people who are the principal protagonists in this story to lead, and for interventionists like ourselves to step back. And so a lot of what we've attempted to do has been to calibrate our engagement. And so where, you know, in the 1990s, you know, the Lauder Foundation was involved in everything. You know, we were involved in so many different things. We were involved, as Shana said, not just in formal education, but we were involved in supporting the rabbinate and supporting the kosher restaurant and supporting the Maccabi sports club and also funding Midrash in partnership with Rothschild and so many other things. We've steadily withdrawn from those things. Some of them stand on their own feet and some don't. The ones that stand on their own feet are the ones that matter enough to people locally. And it's not a criticism of any of the things that don't. Sometimes there are people who heroically stand behind initiatives and projects, but they can't marshal enough resources. That's real, it's normal. It's not just a Poland story. It's a story about anywhere in the world. But I would say that I think one of the most important things that has changed and what we've attempted to do is have a little bit less of us and a little bit more space for people to draw and design and write their own narratives and not simply act as protagonists in a projected narrative that we bring.
Thank you, Josh. This is a very interesting insight into the story, this projected narrative, and stepping back from that. You mentioned the starting point and how you stopped supporting certain areas. Could you just add, what are you supporting right now? So what is the current?
So we remain with kind of our biggest and first investment, which is the school. So the Lauder Marshall School in Warsaw was always kind of the biggest. It was the jewel in the crown, if you will. It was the thing that Mr. Lauder most believed in, and it's the thing that we remain most actively involved in. And what I'm happy to say is that, you know, when we started this thing in the mid-1990s, right, we could have said, you know, It's clear that this is something that is locally needed or driven because parents are choosing to send their children there. And probably that's true, but parents were also choosing to send their children to a private school, an American-funded private school with a nice brand name on it in an exciting building. And so there were a whole set of things there. And so what happened was we came and we said there should be a Jewish school. And there were many who agreed with us. And some of them agreed simply because of the Jewish, and some of them agreed because of the school. When one steps back, one sees more clearly. When we give less and local people give more, when we take fewer decisions and local people take more decisions, then the true local narrative becomes clearer. And so today, the Lauder Morasha School is less a school of the Lauder Foundation in which we drive the curriculum and we make the decisions and we provide the funding. And increasingly, it's something that is locally held. For us, the culmination of this process would be for us to walk away quietly and for there still to be a Lauder Morasha School. And if we were successful, it would continue to exist and it would look differently than it did when we were there.
Thank you. We'll move to Sally with the question about your involvement in Poland. You mentioned that the first project was Midrash, and over the time, certainly the set of organizations, projects that got your support changed. And I would like to ask, what type of institutions are the beneficiaries of your support over the time, how they changed, and what kind of projects you decided to support that haven't been supported at the beginning?
Sure. So I'll give you a sense of our projects, but at the same time, many of your listeners will know that historically we've been anonymous in our funding. And that's part of the traditional family ethos. That anonymous funding is the highest form of giving, and it's just their style. So we continue to give many grants anonymously. However, the family have changed a little bit on that, partly because they've recognized that the use of the name can help an institution, help the stakeholders. So where it can be of benefit, we allow people to use the name, and also where we've created our own projects. So we fund projects, but we also create projects, and I can talk a little briefly about those. And as well as the increasing social media age, there's a feeling of the name is out there anyway. So I just sort of put that as a sort of tenet of the foundation around the use of our name. It's something that we talk about quite a bit, actually. So we have 4 broad areas. You can easily look on the website to see more details, but one area is the academic Jewish studies, doctoral and postdoctoral students, teaching posts. We used to give a lot more for libraries and Jewish studies departments, but then the university started to take those over themselves. A little bit, as Josh was saying, one hopes that if the university thinks the teaching posts are important, they will start to put money into those posts themselves. That has happened in some places and not in others. And many of our scholars have gone on to publish books, articles. Some have come back to teach in the academy, and some have gone on to work in Jewish heritage sites. And I think, so at the next area in terms of heritage sites, so another area we work in is Jewish museums. We've supported Jewish museums in Poland and also state museums that may have Jewish collections, in documenting those collections, digitizing them, creating exhibitions around them. And we've also helped to support the professionals who work in those museums, some of whom would have come from the academic sector. They didn't want to pursue a career in academia, or there weren't jobs, and they've gone into the heritage sector. And we've wanted to support them with professional advice, professional training, and encouraged their stewardship and appreciation of their stewardship of Jewish heritage. The other area is archives and archival collections. The most significant one, of course, which we're happy to name, is the Ringelblum Archive, our support for that. We are also now building a portal for Jewish archives called Yerusha, which will be ready to be launched in the next few months. And there's a lot of Polish archives that are have been integrated into that portal. So we look at state archives where there are Jewish material. So it's a lot about discovering what there is in the state archives and Jewish archives, but particularly in state archives related to Jewish communities over the years. And so again, supporting Jewish archivists, professional training, a lot of digitization. And then the fourth area, which probably is our smallest area, is around the education, community education. We have given small grants to various communal groups focused on adult education, and probably, if I'm honest, not as strategic, certainly not as strategic as the S.Lauder Foundation have been, and been very admiring what they're doing. But we've sought to support small organizations to various degrees with enhancing their own level of Jewish literacy within their community groups. And in terms of changes, we used to give a larger number of smaller grants, and we have moved in some cases to a smaller number of larger grants. Not everywhere, but we've tried to consolidate some of our grant making that way. We've also created our own projects, so that uses up, that takes some grant money. So the Yerusha website that I talked about, the Jewish Heritage Europe website, and a couple of other initiatives not specifically focused on Poland. The age of digitization has changed not so much our work, but the work of the people that we support. And that's increasingly a trend going forward. And the stewardship is an issue. How do we encourage people to go into the field of preserving Jewish heritage and looking after it, documenting it, and ensuring that it's accessible to the public? We very much focus on accessibility of information and developing the networks of people who can support that access. So that we've made more of an attempt to orchestrate opportunities for people for professional development and creating access opportunities. That sort of summarizes our work.
Thank you, Sally. That's so interesting. This also gives a background on Poland, but also leads us to the question how Poland is seen abroad. And I have a question to Jeff, the image and perception of Poland abroad, especially in the States. Did it change over the time? Did it in any way have impacted your work in Poland, the cooperation with the American supporters?
That's a really good question. And when I first saw the question, I sort of laughed to myself. When we first started investing in Poland around 2005, 2 months after I started at Koret, I went with Tad and Shana on one of their fact-finding trips with a group of people. And people would ask me when I got back, or even in the 2 months before I went, if I was crazy. Why Poland? Why give money to a place that was so tragic for the Jewish people? Now, of course, pre-COVID, millions upon millions of tourists travel to Poland every single year. Thousands coming each summer to the Jewish Cultural Festival, original exhibitions created in Poland, traveling to European and US museums. JCCs are sending kids and families educational trips like the Taube Foundation does on an annual basis that Elise Lieberman so aptly is responsible for. And top US universities have developed academic exchanges with the institution. And more so, and the word hasn't even been said in the last 56 minutes. Israel is sending students and tourists to see what is going on. What did the S.Lauders and the Taubes start decades ago? And what will the future portray? All this to say that American Jews have accepted that Poland's Jewish community is thriving, even despite or in spite of the challenges in the government that have occurred over time, and that they're interested in seeing and experiencing this firsthand. Poland has grown, the economy is thriving. You know, it's not just Jewish organizations. And these experiences and occurrences are good for philanthropy for the country, for Jewish organizations, for civic organizations. So from the time I started 15 years ago, in the last 15 years, don't forget, along standing right next to the president of Poland at the opening of Polin was the president of Israel, his first trip as president outside the country.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you for mentioning the State of Israel and Israeli representatives. I think this is the topic that needs a separate discussion, the Israeli involvement in Poland, and we'll try to accommodate it during our activities at Galicia Jewish Museum. But given the time of our discussion, I would like to move to the next question about the differences in the context of your activities and projects in America, especially North America and Europe. Could you point the differences, the major differences of that working in Poland presents? Shana.
Okay. Thanks. One of the main differences is that Poland has not yet developed a philanthropic culture that Jewish communal and cultural organizations can rely on. I mean, and this is also comparable for the nonprofit sector in general. So I would actually say, Josh, to your point about narrative and intervention, I would say less narrative, but continue the funding, please. It's needed. It's needed everywhere. Look, speaking of Israel, it's needed in Israel. Do we stop funding in Israel because they have matured into the kind of society they are? They're still not as strong, don't have as strong a philanthropic culture as in the US. Why did we start the Westberry Group Europe? It was to help build a philanthropic culture for Jewish life in Europe from many different kinds of foundations. The kinds of foundations that exist in Poland today include Stefan Batory and the Kulczyk Foundations. And let's not forget that the Polish government, as elsewhere in Europe, is an important source of funding for Jewish organizations, especially those that are primarily state funded, such as JHI and Polin. So I think that we might consider that ourselves as donors and foundations who support Jewish life and culture in Poland might come together to think again about where things are going philanthropically and how we might help without intervening in narrative. And then I just want to say about Israel, because it did come up in the Q&A in the chat from Larry Huckberg. one of the things that helps us, I mean, our narrative is actually to American Jews about why they should care about Poland for all the reasons that Jeff elaborated so well. But another reason is because of the attitudes towards Israel. There's no BDS movement in Poland of any significance at this time. There's most Polish Jews would much rather go to Israel, which is much closer, and they're in, than to the U.S. They have relatives there. They have there's a familial history with Israel, as well as a yearning for the state of belonging there, and that points to an opportunity that we have found in Poland, which is that our work in Poland has profoundly influenced all of our Jewish philanthropy by awakening our understanding of peoplehood as a central organizing force and reinvigorating Jewish communal interests and increasing multi-generational, multi-ethnic participation in Jewish life and culture. And when I think about looking at the JCCs in the Bay Area today, one of the things I think about is what Kostek Gebert and Monica and Staszek Krajewski and then the S.Lauder Foundation always said about the kindergarten and then the day schools, and Elise Lieberman also is the first principal, that this is where kids would bake challah and learn about Shabbat, and the younger generation would bring Yiddishkeit into their homes on Friday night and for Shabbat. And that's happening at all the Bay Area JCCs through their preschools today. So again, lessons learned from Poland. But I think the reclamation of a sense of Jewish destiny and Jewish belonging that we witness and nurture in Poland has definitely inspired and informed our philanthropy in the Bay Area and Israel.
Thank you, Shana. Do you want to add, Josh?
Yeah, so I'm happy before I respond to Shana by pointing to a major difference that we experience, I would say that there's one thing that is absolutely the same about Poland. The Ronald S.Lauder Foundation works in many different countries and many different Jewish communities in Europe, and it's a bit of a controlled experiment because we essentially do the same thing in different places. And one thing that is absolutely the same about the Polish Jewish community is that it believes it is completely and entirely unique. Every Jewish community believes that it is completely and entirely unique. And every Jewish community has reason for doing so. The Polish Jewish community thinks it's completely and entirely unique, just like every other community. But there are things that are different. One of the things that we found that's different, and I think this is an important point to take on kind of in response to and in development of the point that Shana made, is that in our experience, and this is really only in the field where we work, in our experience, the area of lay leadership, non-paid leadership in governance roles is very weak compared to every other Jewish community in neighboring countries, in the Baltics, in Central Europe. Every other community of comparable size has a much more robust group of lay leaders who are people generally of standing and professional capacity or means in their own non-Jewish professions, who then step up and assume responsibility for driving a narrative. That makes it a lot easier to give money somewhere without projecting a narrative. Not giving money and not projecting a narrative is easy. Giving money and projecting a narrative is easy. Giving money and not projecting a narrative is hard. It requires somebody else to receive the money and create the narrative. And again, our experience has been that lay leadership, for whatever reasons, but lay leadership, the willingness of people of standing and capability to assume governance roles without taking salaries for it relative to other European Jewish communities is poor. And that presents a huge challenge.
Thank you, Jeff.
Good point.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Jeff.
Yeah, I want to bring up something that nobody's really talked about. And maybe it's my 30 years in banking, but the main difference and challenge to overcome is proximity. When we give as a philanthropy to an organization that we can do a site visit and kick the tires and see things as to whether they're meeting certain requirements or hurdles, it's a lot easier. When funding organizations in Israel or Poland, you have to overcome the ability to build not just giving to an organization, but relationships with people, with the leadership within those organizations, be it the executive directors or the board chairs. For example, we know that Cuba's integrity is key to our funding of the Galicia Museum. We know that Janusz's passion for bringing the best culture to Poland each year is second to none. And Jonathan Ornstein's mentioning this in Shabbat dinners and programmatic opportunities for people who want to celebrate is always there. And Rabbi Shudrick's savviness in creating and leveraging what the S.Lauder Foundation did educationally at the very beginning of all this, it is key to building a vibrant Jewish community and looking beyond that. And let's not forget, if it weren't, in my humble opinion, if it weren't for people like Barbara Kirschenblatt Gimlet, that museum, the Pauline Museum, wouldn't be there. And the leadership that has occurred after that, both in Dariush and Antony and the people that have followed. So while philanthropists give to institutions and initiatives, they also give to people. Something I learned decades and decades ago as a banker. If you want the money back, you make sure that the people that you're making loans to can execute.
I just briefly add on that, because I noted a similar thing to myself, that's true, but our relationships are mediated by gatekeepers. And that may be our fault, because I don't speak Polish. So I have to rely on people who speak English, who can sort of enter a frame of reference that makes sense to me.
I rely on Shana, excuse me, she speaks Polish.
No, I say that's a limitation of my limitation. I'm not, but we rely on these mediated gatekeepers to give us access, and that's an interesting dynamic. I just think, try to picking up on your point. It's that's a tricky thing, I think.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time from afar keeping abreast of what's happening in Poland, both from both by speaking to people and reading the newspapers and other kinds of media.
We can follow the questions that we already had, but we cannot ignore the reality, which is time. We've been already online for 70 minutes, but also the something that surrounds us, the change situation, the new reality with COVID that affected all our lives and the communities and the institutions. So I would like to close the discussion with the round of quick answers to the question, what will the future of the Jewish communities and institutions that you support be? Have you already updated your goals and methods, forms of support? Do you have any ideas or tips? Just a quick answer. I know it's a broad topic, but just to follow the question by Gershon Hundert about the obstacles. This is one of the obstacles.
So maybe I'll lead off here. I just, Jeff's point about relationships and the difficulty of funding from afar is exactly why I sit in Berlin. And so we're an American private family foundation. We fund exclusively in Central and Eastern Europe, but we have always, whether the chief executive, over the last 20 years, the chief executive has been based, irrespective, my predecessor was a Hungarian based in Budapest. I'm an American, but I'm based in Berlin, and that's for easy access. And so, before COVID, I was in Poland pretty frequently, about once a month for a regular meeting, sometimes more frequently when necessary. One of the challenges and the opportunities of COVID is I can't get there as much. And that creates space. And so one of the ways in which we've updated is by using this time, which is really a stress test. It's a stress test in so many different ways, but using this as a stress test of people's ability to step up and make the kind of decisions and shoulder the kind of responsibility that we would have as a major funder otherwise been critical. Even if we were being respectful and creating space, it's different when you're not there. And it's different when it's clear to the people locally that you're not just not there because you can't physically travel there, but you're also not going to do this by Zoom. You're going to let them do it. And so I think one of the challenges here is also an opportunity, which is if the distance, if the stress test around our absence is turned into a positive, and people use the opportunity to make decisions and step up more actively, then this will be a very positive outcome, very positive.
Yeah, I want to just follow up on that, Josh, because I think COVID has exposed even the most stable organizations, most stable nonprofit organizations. Some will survive and some won't. It's pushed some organizations that people thought might not have survived to stretch their thinking, be able to economize, and be more introspective. I think that going forward, I would continue as a commentary to ask the question about relevancy and mission. Has there over the years during the good times and prosperous times, it's easy with funding to expand beyond the organization's immediate mission. However, in today's time, I think that this might mean recognizing that the organization is better off as part of a different organization, or, merging with somebody else, or refocusing their specific mission so that all the wonderful things that they did are more focused.
Shana?
I think in general, how our foundation looks at COVID and post-COVID is that the organizations we have supported have suffered, have impressively pivoted into new forms of organization and operation and production. There's a lot of innovation. The organizations in the Bay Area that we support, like the 6 JCCs, relied on 80% to 90% on income generating activities like the fitness center and lectures and preschools. And that's not the case now. So they're suffering quite a lot. And I would say on the whole, for the Jewish organizations that we support in Poland, where the pandemic has not been as severe as it has been in the US and has not been as continuous as it has been in the US. Now Poland is suffering quite a bit, but you were open over the summer. Museums opened, schools and camps opened. And we haven't had that. We've been on much more of a roller coaster, and to boot out here, we've had wildfires closing down all the activities that were shifted to the outdoors. So what I think is that we're speaking with organizations that we support in Poland as well as in the Bay Area, we're looking at a recovery phase over the next year plus. And then from there will be a gradual revamping of activities. I think that some organizations have been able to save resources that were earmarked for 2020, and we have approved them being rolled over into 2021. Or they were used for emergency operational support. So organizations that we support, we will continue to support. I would say that an organization like the Pauline Museum, which relies 25% of its income comes from visitorship, another 25% from private donors, those are the areas in which it has suffered the most. And we do applaud the Polish Ministry of Culture for stepping in, and the city of Warsaw for stepping in with some important emergency support this year.
Thank you, Shana. And Sally, would you like to add anything?
No, only briefly that the foundations need to perhaps pivot as well, and that we're going to go through a time of transition, perhaps in response to what the organizations are also, how flexible we can be will be really important to help those organizations as they make certain transitions, just to be mindful of that. I mean, I think specifically in the academic Jewish studies, we're seeing a lot of, they're going to be in a state of crisis, and already they are. And that's going to be a challenge to foundations that are supporting them. That's a very specific interest. But I think we all have to, it's not just the organizations that need to be thinking about transitioning, but also the foundations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. We could talk about all these important topics and matters and other stuff for hours, but it's my role to keep the time and to finish it when we need to finish. We've been online for more than 70 minutes, and that's the time to close our discussion. Thank you all for participation in this panel. We've been happy to have you as the fabulous speakers and sharing the insights with us. Many thanks to all the people in the audience participating online, watching us on Zoom, Facebook, YouTube. Our discussion has been recorded, so those who haven't been able to join us will have a chance to watch it again, watch it later. And last but not least, I would like to say thank you to the people behind the scenes, to Tomasz Struk, who was responsible for the application Photographs from Jewish Poland, and this application was like an excuse for our discussion and a series of topics. And I would like to say thank you to Jakub Nowakowski, Kuba, who set up this panel discussion and who made sure that everything worked perfectly well. And as Kuba's integrity was mentioned by Jeff, I would like to take the privilege and use this opportunity to congratulate Kuba on his 10th anniversary of being the director of Galicia Jewish Museum. So thank you, Kuba, not just for today, but for this 10 years of your commitment to our museum. And thank you all again, best wishes, happy Hanukkah, and I hope to continue this discussion in person.
Yes.
Very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Gratulacji.
Thank you very much.
Nice to see you all.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye now.
All the best.
Bye.
And,
Nice to meet you, Jeff. Bye.
Good to see you again, Sally.
Been a while. Bye.